So the slave trade was started by the Portuguese, and this began in the mid 1400s. And again, from the very beginning, they found that it was far easier to trade for the slaves rather than going in and trying to raid African villages for their own slaves. And so it started small, and especially once they began to rediscover islands in the Atlantic, like the Canaries. They begin to import slaves to those sugar plantations that they built on those islands. Well, everything changes and intensifies with the discovery of the Americas. And once plantations spread in the Americas, they found that the Native Americans weren't filling that labor need. Most had died out due to Afro-Eurasian diseases, and they really weren't well suited to being forced to work on these plantations. And so that's going to lead to a huge intensification in the export of slaves from Africa to the Americas. It was to fill this labor need in the Americas on these plantations, especially the sugar plantations, but a wide variety of plantations. And so the triangular trade route, this is a very simplified way at looking at these exchanges. In actuality, it was much more complicated than this, but basically there were three main legs of this triangular trade route. It brought manufactured goods from Europe to Africa. And so things like textiles, metalwares, guns, again, were especially important and would have a huge impact on parts of Africa. And sometimes simple things. Different regions of Africa use different things for currency. So some parts of Africa use cowrie shells as a form of currency. And so Europeans would have to go and gather up cowrie shells to trade to Africa. And so these manufactured goods from Europe would be brought to Africa in exchange for slaves. Then the slaves would be taken across what's known as the Middle Passage to the Americas. And once they were in the Americas, they would be sold or traded for American cash crops and raw materials. And then these raw materials would be taken back to Europe, where they would be used, where they would be manufactured in European factories. And this whole process would start over again. And so every single stage of the slave trade was extremely brutal. And it begins in Africa. Powerful kingdoms would launch slave raids or wars on neighbors to capture slaves. You'd have slave raiders that would travel to the interior parts of Africa to gather up slaves. And then they would be forced to march miles and miles to the coast, where they would basically be kept in holding pens until the European ships arrived. And then once the European ships arrived, they were loaded on these ships and taken across what's known as the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage was just the middle part of that triangular trade route. And many died en route across the Middle Passage. Estimates are as high as 25% of all the slaves taken out of Africa across to America died before they ever reached America. And some of them starved to death. Some of them starved themselves to death. If you were sick, they often threw you overboard so you didn't infect the rest of the people on board. So again, every single stage was extremely brutal. And then once they reached the Americas, they were auctioned off and forced to go and work on these plantations. So when we look at the impact the slave trade had on Africa, first off, the sheer volume of the slave trade is staggering. Upwards of 12 million slaves were taken from Africa to the Americas during this period. And again, estimates range maybe as high as 25% of them never reached the Americas. And when you combine that with the Muslim slave trade, which continued during this period, and the Muslim slave trade from 800 CE to about 1800 CE, they took another 10 million or so slaves out of Africa. And this is going to have a huge impact on the development of Africa. So first off, some of these social effects. In some parts of Africa, it actually distorted the sex ratios, the gender ratios. And because the Atlantic slave trade took far more men than women, it often left societies with more women. And so this is going to lead to things like an increase in polygamy. And it also meant that generation after generation lost the best of their population. They weren't taking the old and the weak. They took the best of what Africa had. And so for centuries, over and over again, Africa was losing the best of their population. For generations, they were losing future leaders and intellectuals and workers. And so that's going to have a big impact on the development of Africa. Politically, guns are going to change the landscape in parts of Africa. The kingdoms that traded with Europe for firearms are going to use those firearms to make war on neighboring kingdoms and extend their own power. And so it's going to lead to an increase in conflict and violence in many parts of Africa. Economically, Africa is going to fail to develop their own industries. And we see something similar take place in Latin America as well, to where they become dependent on the West. And so in this era, rather than develop their own industries, they're going to export slaves and raw materials. And even in the next era, when slavery is eventually abolished, they still were dependent on Europe, and they were exporting cash crops or raw materials. And so it led to a situation where they become economically dependent on the West. And this is a problem that plagues parts of Africa all the way to present day.